At 7:02 a.m. on December 7, 1941, two young American soldiers stared at a radar screen 230 feet above Opana Point on the northern tip of Oahu. Private Joseph Lockhart, a 24-year-old from Pennsylvania, and Private George Elliott, still learning the new equipment, watched as an unprecedented blip appeared on their oscilloscope, the largest radar return either man had ever seen. "Do you think the set is working right?" Elliott asked, his voice uncertain. Lockhart adjusted the controls, his trained eyes analyzing the signal. The blip wasn't an error. It represented aircraft lots of them 132 miles away, and closing fast. At 7:20 a.m., after 20 minutes of tracking, Lockhart made a phone call to the information center at Fort Chaffee. An officer on temporary duty, Lieutenant Kermit Tyler, dismissed his report with 5 words that would echo through history: "Don't worry about it." 40 minutes later, 183 Japanese aircraft appeared over Pearl Harbor like avenging angels, delivering devastation that would pull America into World War II. The radar had worked perfectly. The humans had failed. But here's the question that haunted both sides for the rest of the war. Why didn't the Japanese expect radar to see them coming? And more importantly, how did this single technological advantage, this invisible electronic eye, transform from a curiosity into an overwhelming tactical weapon that Japanese pilots came to fear more than enemy fighters themselves? The story of America's radar revolution isn't just about technology. It's about intelligence, adaptation, and the deadly price of underestimating your enemy. Because by night, Japanese kamikaze pilots flying their final missions would encounter something their predecessors at Pearl Harbor never imagined: a radar picket network so comprehensive, so relentless, that the Americans knew they were coming from the moment they took off and were waiting with fighters, guns, and an invisible electronic net they couldn't escape. This is the story of how an experimental technology became Japan's nightmare, and why even the most determined warriors couldn't fight what they couldn't see. To understand how radar changed everything, we need to go back to the beginning, to a time when neither side fully grasped what they were building. At night, radar was bleeding-edge technology, so new that most military leaders didn't understand its implications. The British had pioneered operational radar with their chain-home system during the Battle of Britain in 1940, providing early warning of German bomber raids. The Americans, recognizing the technology's potential, had been racing to develop their own systems. The -270 Seychelles rupees radar that detected the Pearl Harbor attack was one of just 6 units deployed on Oahu. It was a mobile long-range early warning radar, capable of detecting aircraft up to 150 miles away. The entire apparatus could be packed onto 2 trucks, though the massive rotating antenna array, a towering lattice of metal and wire, made it far from subtle. But here's what made the -270 Seychelles rupees revolutionary: it could see what human eyes couldn't. At 7:02 a.m. on December 7th, Japanese aircraft were still 132 miles away, 40 minutes of flight time, well beyond any optical detection. The radar saw them immediately, tracked them continuously, and could have provided enough warning for every fighter at Pearl Harbor to scramble, for anti-aircraft crews to man their stations, for ships to weigh anchor and scatter. The technology worked. The system failed. Lieutenant Tyler's dismissal of the radar contact wasn't stupidity, was inexperience. He assumed the blips were American B-17 bombers expected to arrive from California that morning. The radar operators, trained in the technical operation of the equipment, had no authority to sound alerts themselves. The information center was minimally staffed on a Sunday morning. Everything that could go wrong in a new, untested early warning system did go wrong. The Japanese, meanwhile, operated under a completely different set of assumptions. Commander Mitsuo, leading the first wave of the Pearl Harbor attack, had planned his approach based on the premise that American defenses relied on visual observation and routine air patrols. The Japanese concept of naval warfare emphasized surprise, speed, and concentrated striking power, the sudden, devastating blow that destroys the enemy before they can respond. Radio silence during the approach, low altitude ingress, attacking at dawn when defenders were least alert, these were the pillars of their tactical doctrine. What they didn't anticipate was an electronic eye that never blinked, never got tired, and could see through darkness, clouds, and the curvature of the Earth itself. Did you know that the Japanese had actually developed their own radar technology? In fact, Japanese engineers had produced a cavity magnetron, the key component for symmetric radar, as early as 1937, potentially before the British. But here's where strategic culture made all the difference. Japanese military leadership didn't prioritize radar development. They viewed war through a lens of warrior spirit, tactical brilliance, and offensive action. Defensive systems like radar didn't fit their doctrinal emphasis on aggressive, decisive engagement. By mid-1941, while the U.S. Navy was installing CM air search radars on aircraft carriers and the Army was deploying SCR-270 units throughout the Pacific, Japanese carriers sailed without radar altogether. Their early warning system consisted of lookouts with binoculars and combat air patrols flying visual search patterns. It was a system perfected over years of training, and it was becoming obsolete. The attack on Pearl Harbor succeeded despite radar detection because human error broke the chain. But that failure taught the Americans a lesson they would never forget. Radar was only as good as the system built around it. Within months, the U.S. military embarked on a comprehensive program to not just deploy radar, but integrate it into a complete early warning and fighter direction network. The Japanese, flush with their stunning victory, drew a different conclusion. Radar hadn't stopped them. Therefore, radar wasn't a game changer. That assumption would prove fatal. 6 months after Pearl Harbor, the two fleets met again at Midway Atoll, and this time, radar made all the difference. On the morning of June 4, 1942, radar operators on Midway Island picked up the incoming Japanese strike force at 5:53 a.m. While the aircraft were still 93 miles out. Unlike at Pearl Harbor, this warning was heeded. Every available American fighter scrambled. Anti-aircraft crews manned their guns. Bomber crews prepared for immediate launch. When the Japanese arrived, they faced fierce resistance and, crucially, the Americans knew exactly where to find the Japanese carriers. All three American carriers at Midway, USS Enterprise, USS Hornet, and USS Yorktown, were equipped with CXAM radar. These massive rotating antenna arrays, mounted on tall masts above the flight decks, provided 360-degree coverage out to 100 miles. But it wasn't just about detection range. The radar allowed American ships to maintain combat air patrols with unprecedented efficiency, vectoring fighters toward incoming threats with radio guidance. The Japanese carriers had no such advantage. Their combat air patrol relied entirely on visual sighting and voice radio reports from pilots. When American dive bombers appeared over the Japanese fleet at 10:22 a.m. on June 4th, there was no early warning, no time to vector fighters into position, no systematic defense. In just 6 minutes, 3 Japanese carriers, Kagai Kaga and Soryo, were burning wrecks. The fourth, Haryu, would follow by evening. Admiral Kiichi Nagumo, commanding the Japanese carrier force, later reflected on the battle and captured documents. The absence of radar, he noted, had left his fleet fighting blind. American carriers detected incoming attacks with enough warning to launch fighters and prepare defenses. Japanese carriers depended on look-on, whether a lookout happened to be scanning the right patch of sky at the right moment. But the real transformation wasn't happening on capital ships. It was happening in the air. By 1943, American fighter direction had evolved into an art form. Aboard carriers and on island bases, specialized teams tracked aircraft on radar scopes, calculating vectors, altitudes, and intercept solutions. Fighter director, officers often abbreviated as FDO, became the quarterback of aerial combat, orchestrating multiple sections of fighters like pieces on a chessboard. Commander John Crommelin, a fighter director aboard USS Enterprise, described the process. We could see raids forming up 100 miles away. We'd launch fighters, climb them to altitude, and vector them directly to the intercept point. The Japanese pilots never knew what hit them. They'd be cruising along, thinking they had the element of surprise. And suddenly, our Hellcats were diving through their formation. 4 Japanese pilots accustomed to scouting, maneuvering, and engaging on their own terms. This was a psychological shock. There was no hiding, no surprising the Americans. The enemy always seemed to know they were coming, always had fighters waiting, always appeared to be one step ahead. Lieutenant Saburo Sakai, one of Japan's top aces who survived the war, wrote in his memoirs about the growing sense of unease. American fighters appeared with uncanny precision, as if they had been expecting us at that exact spot. We assumed they had superior intelligence or extensive air patrol coverage. It wasn't until much later that I understood they were simply tracking us on radar, watching our every move, like hawks observing mice in an open field. By 1944, the disparity had become overwhelming. American escort carriers, built on merchant ship hulls and mass-produced by the dozens, carried fighter direction teams and radar equipment that would have been unthinkable 3 years earlier. These jeep carriers formed the backbone of invasion support groups, providing both air cover and early warning for amphibious operations. Their TDR air search radars could detect incoming aircraft at 80 to 100 miles, giving defenders ample time to scramble fighters or prepare anti-aircraft batteries. Japanese air power, meanwhile, was withering. Veteran pilots who had honed their skills before the war were dying in growing numbers, replaced by hastily trained recruits with perhaps 50 hours of flight time, compared to the 300 to 400 hours standard for American pilots. These novices, flying outdated aircraft with minimal tactical training, stood no chance against American fighters guided by radar to perfect intercept positions. Did you know that American radar technology by 1944 could track individual aircraft and distinguish between friendly and enemy formations, identification, friend or foe AFF transponders installed on American aircraft? automatically transmitted coded signals when interrogated by radar. Enemy aircraft, lacking these transponders, showed up as hostile contacts. The system wasn't perfect. All readings and equipment failures occurred regularly, but it provided another layer of information that Japanese forces completely lacked. But the most devastating application of radar was yet to come. As American forces pushed closer to the Japanese home islands, the concept of radar picket stations emerged. These were destroyer escort vessels stationed 30 to 50 miles ahead of the main fleet, bristling with radar, antennas, and fighter direction equipment. Their job, detect incoming threats at maximum range and vector combat air patrol fighters to intercept. The picket ships were isolated, vulnerable, and absolutely essential. They became priority targets for Japanese attacks, and the scene of some of the most intense naval combat of the entire war. On April 16, 1945, the destroyer USS Laffey DD-724 was manning radar picket station No. 1 off Okinawa, one of the most dangerous assignments in the U.S. Navy. At approximately 8:30 a.m., the ship's SK air search radar detected multiple bogies inbound. What followed was one of the most intense kamikaze attacks in history. For 80 minutes, USS Laffey fought for her life. 22 Japanese aircraft attacked the single destroyer. The ship's 5-inch guns, 40mm anti-aircraft batteries, and 20mm cannons blazed continuously. The crew shot down 9 attackers, but 6 kamikazes crashed into the ship, and 4 bombs struck home. Fires raged across multiple decks. 32 sailors died, 71 were wounded, and yet, Laffey survived. Her radar continued functioning. Her fighter directors continued vectoring cap fighters toward incoming threats. Her guns continued firing. A destroyer that should have sunk 3 times over refused to die on her radar, kept working until she was towed to safety on April 17. Seminari Faltrides, who survived the attack, later recalled, "Our radar gave us just enough warning, maybe 3-4 minutes sometimes. Enough to train the guns, get ready. Without it, we wouldn't have seen them until they were right on top of us. Every second of warning mattered." This was the reality of 1945. American radar networks so dense, so capable, that Japanese pilots flying suicide missions couldn't approach the fleet without being detected, tracked, and engaged from the moment they appeared on scope. The Japanese tried everything. They flew low, skimming the wave tops to stay under radar coverage, but American ships were equipped with surface search radars that could spot aircraft flying at 50 feet. They flew high and fast, but altitude only made them visible at even greater ranges. They flew in bad weather, but radar worked through rain, fog, and darkness. They launched massive coordinated strikes, hoping to overwhelm defenses, but radar allowed defenders to prioritize threats, vector fighters to the most dangerous groups, and concentrate fire where it mattered most. Nothing worked. What the Japanese never fully grasped was that radar wasn't just a detection device, it was the foundation of an entire combat system. Detection fed into fighter direction. Fighter direction enabled efficient cap operations. Efficient cap operations freed up more aircraft for strike missions. Strike missions were coordinated using radar navigation. Every element reinforced every other element, creating a network effect that multiplied American combat effectiveness far beyond the simple sum of its parts. By mid-19, Japanese commanders knew they were sending pilots to their deaths against a defense network they could neither see nor counter. Radar had become the invisible barrier that protected American fleets, American invasion forces, American airspace. For Japanese pilots, it was like fighting a ghost enemy that saw everything, knew everything, and couldn't be fought because it wasn't even there. The ultimate proof of radar's dominance came during the Battle of Okinawa, the largest amphibious invasion of the Pacific War. From April through June 1945, Japanese forces launched 10 massive kaikasui, floating chrysanthemum, kamikaze operations, hurling over 1,500 aircraft at the American fleet in desperate attempts to turn the tide. The radar picket destroyers formed the first line of defense. Imagine the tactical situation. 15 radar picket stations arranged in a semicircle 30 to 50 miles offshore, each manned by 1 or 2 destroyers equipped with air search radar and fighter direction teams. Their radars swept the sky continuously, overlapping coverage areas, creating a surveillance network that could detect raids forming over Japanese airfields 100 miles away. Captain Frederick Moosbrugger, commanding the destroyer squadron whose ships manned these picket stations, later wrote, "The picket ships were the fleet's eyes and ears. Every raid we detected, every fighter intercept we directed, potentially saved dozens or hundreds of lives on the invasion transports and carriers. We accepted casualties because the mission was that critical." The statistics tell the story. During the Okinawa campaign, radar picket ships detected and reported over 90% of all incoming raids. Fighter directors aboard these ships vectored cap fighters to intercept positions, resulting in hundreds of Japanese aircraft being shot down before they reached the main fleet. American casualties were horrific. 15 radar picket ships were sunk, 45 damaged, over 1,200 sailors killed, but the invasion proceeded according to schedule. The troop transports, supply ships, and fleet carriers essential to the operation were protected by this electronic shield purchased with the blood of destroyer crews. On May 11, 1945, the destroyer, USS Hugh W. Hadley, DD-2774, and the smaller landing craft support ship, LCSL-83, were manning picket, Station 15, when they detected a massive raid inbound. Over the next 90 minutes, they faced approximately 50 kamikaze and conventional attack aircraft. Lieutenant Commander Baron Mulvaney, commanding Hadley, later described the battle. Our radar was tracking so many contacts we couldn't count them all. The scope looked like a snowstorm. We directed fighters to the main groups, shot down what we could, and tried to survive what got through. The two ships shot down 23 confirmed aircraft. But kamikazes hit Hadley 4 times, causing catastrophic damage. LCS-83 was struck twice and sank. Hadley remained afloat barely and was towed to safety with 28 dead and 67 wounded. Her radar had functioned until the moment power failed. This was the crucible. American sailors dying to maintain radar coverage that protected thousands of others. The Japanese, for their part, understood what they were up against. Captured documents and post-war interrogations revealed that Japanese pilots received specific briefings about American radar capabilities. They knew the picket ships were the early warning network. They knew that destroying these ships would blind the fleet. That's why picket stations drew such concentrated attacks. But knowing about radar and countering it were two different things. Did you know that by 1945, the Japanese developed primitive radar warning receivers devices that could detect American radar transmissions and alert pilots they were being tracked? Some kamikaze aircraft were equipped with these receivers, giving pilots a warning tone when search radars locked onto them. But knowing you're being tracked doesn't help if you can't hide, can't evade, and your mission is to die crashing into a ship anyway. The fundamental problem was technological. Japanese radar development had stagnated, while American sets by 1945 were fourth-generation equipment with automatic tracking, planned position indicators showing 360-degree coverage, and sophisticated IFF integration. Japanese radars, when they existed at all, were crude, short-ranged, and poorly integrated into fire control systems. A comparative example illustrates the gap. The American SK air search radar, installed on Essex-class carriers in 1944, could reliably detect aircraft at 100 miles, track up to 50 separate contacts simultaneously, and provide accurate bearing and range information for fighter direction. The Japanese Type 21 radar, installed on carrier Shinano in 1944, had a maximum range of 45 miles and could track perhaps a dozen contacts with marginal accuracy. By late 1944, the disparity was measured in years. American radar technology was estimated to be 3 to 5 years ahead of Japanese equivalents. This wasn't just about better engineering, it was about industrial capacity, research and development, investment, and the operational experience gained from actually using radar in combat for years. The Americans learned, the Japanese, isolated and bombed into defensive positions, couldn't keep up. On August 15, 1945, Emperor Hirohito announced Japan's surrender. For the first time in history, recorded testimony from Japanese pilots surviving the war became available to American intelligence. Their descriptions of facing American radar defenses painted a picture of technological dominance that went far beyond simple detection. One pilot, whose name was redacted in declassified documents, described his experience during a raid on American carriers. "We approached from the north at low altitude, believing we might avoid detection. But when we were still 30 kilometers away, American fighters appeared directly ahead of us, perfectly positioned for an interception. It was as if they had been waiting at that exact location. Half our formation was shot down before we even saw the fleet. I survived only because I broke formation and fled." This was the reality. Radar didn't just detect, it dominated, it controlled. The battle space dictated the tempo of engagement and gave American forces the ultimate tactical advantage: knowledge. The Americans knew where Japanese forces were, where they were going, and approximately when they would arrive. The Japanese, flying into this electronic surveillance web, might as well have been wearing bells. When the war ended, American technical intelligence teams fanned out across Japan, cataloging equipment, interrogating engineers, and assessing the state of Japanese radar development. What they found confirmed what combat experience had already taught them. The technological gap was insurmountable. Japanese radar facilities revealed equipment that was, in the words of one Naval Technical Mission report, generally crude, poorly designed, and inadequately integrated into operational systems. The Japanese had possessed the fundamental physics and engineering knowledge to build capable radars, but they lacked the industrial capacity, the operational experience, and perhaps most critically, The institutional willingness to prioritize defensive technologies. Lieutenant Commander Haruki Iki, a Japanese naval officer who worked on radar development during the war, was interviewed by American investigators in October 1945. His testimony was revealing. "We understood that the Americans possessed superior radar. Our pilots reported being intercepted by fighters who seemed to know exactly where to find them. But we could not match your production capacity or your integration of radar into fleet operations. We built individual sets. You've built systems." This distinction between technology and systems was the real lesson of radar in the Pacific War. The Americans didn't just invent better radars, though they did. They built an entire operational doctrine around radar capabilities, fighter direction teams, radar picket stations, combat information centers, processing multiple data sources, standardized procedures for threat assessment and response. Radar was the nervous system of a coordinated defense organism that functioned as more than the sum of its parts. The fate of individual operators tells the human story behind the technology. Private Joseph Lockord, who detected the Pearl Harbor raid, was awarded the Distinguished Service Medal for his actions, though, by the time he received it, the initial controversy over why his warning was ignored had faded into history. He survived the war and lived until carrying the knowledge that his radar had worked perfectly while the system around it failed. Lieutenant Kermit Tyler, who told Lockard, "Don't worry about it," became the focus of intense scrutiny after Pearl Harbor. He testified multiple times before investigative boards, explaining his reasoning. He was cleared of any wrongdoing. His error was judged to be honest mistake by an inexperienced officer in an untested system. But the incident followed him for the rest of his life. He retired from the Air Force in 1961 with the rank of lieutenant colonel and died in 2010. The last surviving principal in the Pearl Harbor radar detection controversy. The crew of USS, the ship that would not die, received a Presidential Unit Citation for their actions during the kamikaze attack off Okinawa. The destroyer was repaired and remained in service until 1975. Today, she's a museum ship at Patriots Point Naval and Maritime Museum in Charleston, South Carolina. Her radar antennas, still mounted above the bridge, silent monuments to the technology that helped her survive. For the Japanese pilots who faced this electronic wall, there was no glory in defeat. Post-war Japan, shattered and occupied, had little interest in lionizing pilots who lost. The few who survived kamikaze missions, either by being unable to find targets or by aborting due to mechanical failures, returned to a nation that viewed them with suspicion or pity. The broader culture of the immediate post-war period emphasized moving forward, not dwelling on the failures of the past, but scattered through memoirs and oral histories. Their voices remain testifying to the shock of encountering an enemy who saw everything. The Americans had magic. One former pilot said in a 1980s interview, "They knew where we were before we knew where they were. It was like fighting blind against an opponent with perfect vision." That magic had a name: radar. And it cost thousands of sailors who manned the equipment, processed the data, and stood watch while invisible electronic eyes searched the sky. The story of radar in the Pacific War teaches us something fundamental about technological advantage in conflict. Superiority isn't just about having better equipment. It's about understanding what that equipment makes possible and building your entire operation around it. The Japanese entered the war with superb pilots, excellent aircraft, and aggressive tactical doctrine. They possessed radar technology, albeit primitive compared to Allied systems. What they lacked was the operational imagination to understand how radar could reshape warfare and the industrial capacity to implement that vision even if they'd had it. The Americans had neither the best pilots nor the best aircraft in 1941, but they had organizational flexibility, industrial might, and leaders willing to embrace new technology and adapt doctrine to exploit it. By 1945, they had constructed an integrated air defense network that made carrier operations possible in the face of determined kamikaze attacks, something that would have been unthinkable just 4 years earlier. Consider the numbers. During the Okinawa campaign, Japanese forces launched over 1,900 kamikaze sorties. Approximately 14% successfully struck ships, a testament to the extraordinary courage and skill of the pilots, but also evidence of an 86% attrition rate. The vast majority of those losses can be attributed to radar-directed defenses, early warning, allowing fighters to intercept at maximum range, fire control radars improving anti-aircraft accuracy, and fighter direction maximizing the efficiency of combat air patrols. Without radar, those percentages would have reversed. American casualties would have been catastrophic. The invasion of Japan would have faced aerial opposition that might have rendered it impossible. Instead, by August 1945, American carrier task forces operated off the coast of Japan itself, their radars scanning Japanese airspace with impunity, their fighter directors vectoring strike packages toward targets while simultaneously managing defensive patrols. The invisible eye had become all-seeing. The hunters had become the hunted. One final story captures the human dimension of this. Technological transformation. In October 1945, during the initial occupation of Japan, an American radar operator named Robert Larson encountered a former Japanese pilot in a Tokyo bar. After initial awkwardness, the conversation turned to the war. The Japanese pilot, who had flown in the Battle of the Philippine Sea, described his confusion and terror at facing American defenses that seemed omniscient. Larson later recounted, "I tried to explain how radar worked, how we could see aircraft as electronic blips on a screen." He nodded, understanding the principle, but then he said something I've never forgotten. "I knew you could see us. What I couldn't understand was how to fight an enemy whose eyes were everywhere, who saw in the dark, who never blinked." It wasn't fear of dying. It was the helplessness of being seen but not able to see. That helplessness, the experience of being tracked by an invisible opponent, was Japan's technological nightmare. And it was a nightmare the Americans engineered with extraordinary thoroughness. From the -270 Seychelles rupees that saw the Pearl Harbor raid to the dense radar networks that protected the Okinawa invasion. When Japanese commanders acknowledged defeat, they cited many factors: overwhelming American industrial production, strategic errors in their own military planning, the atomic bombs, but in quiet moments, some admitted a more fundamental truth. They had been fighting blind against an enemy who could see, and no amount of courage or skill could overcome that disadvantage. The radar operators who manned the scopes, the fighter directors who vectored the fighters, the engineers who designed the systems, and the sailors who died protecting the picket ships, they won a war that most of them couldn't fully see. Their victory was measured in blips on a screen, radio calls guiding fighters to intercepts, and enemy aircraft that never reached their targets. They created the invisible wall that Japanese pilots could neither penetrate nor escape, a wall that would reshape warfare for the rest of the century and beyond. Because once you can see your enemy before they see you, warfare is no longer about courage or tactics alone. It's about information. And in that battle, the Americans had already won before the first shot was fired.